I exposed my wife's paternity fraud scheme when she tried to manipulate me into raising another man's baby, and I reclaimed my life and identity fully. She came home that Tuesday evening, sat down on our couch, and said she wanted to have a baby. Just like that. No build-up, no romantic conversation, just a direct statement that hit me like a cold slap. The problem? We hadn't been intimate in over 4 months. 4 months of her turning away every time I tried to initiate anything. 4 months of excuses, headaches, too tired, too stressed, too busy. 4 months of me sleeping next to a woman who acted like my touch was toxic. And now she wanted a baby. I kept my expression neutral, but inside every alarm bell was screaming. You don't go from zero physical interest to wanting to create life together overnight. That's not how healthy relationships work. That's not how women work. Something had shifted, and it wasn't in my favor. She sat there with this hopeful smile, talking about cribs and baby names, while I calculated the timeline in my head. When had she started being distant? When had the excuses begun? It all started around the same time she picked up those extra shifts at work, the same time she became more protective of her phone. I watched her as she spoke, noting details I'd ignored before. The way she avoided eye contact when talking about this sudden baby fever, how her hands fidgeted with her wedding ring, how she seemed almost nervous, like she was trying to sell me something. What brought this on? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Last month you said we should wait until we were more financially stable. She had an answer ready. Too ready. Something about her biological clock, about seeing her sister's new baby, about feeling ready now. All perfectly reasonable explanations that felt rehearsed. When someone has to convince you they want something they never mentioned before, they're usually hiding the real reason. I nodded along, playing the supportive husband while my mind raced through possibilities. None of them were good. A woman doesn't suddenly want a baby after months of rejecting her husband unless there's already a baby on the way. And if there was already a baby on the way, it sure as hell wasn't mine. The math was simple. We hadn't been together intimately since early winter. Here we were in late spring, and she was pushing for us to start trying immediately. If I agreed and she announced a pregnancy in a few weeks, I'd be expected to believe it was mine. Perfect timing for her. Disastrous timing for me. I've never been the type to ignore red flags or convince myself that obvious problems don't exist. When something doesn't add up, there's usually a reason. When your wife goes from ice cold to baby fever overnight, she's not having a change of heart about motherhood. She's trying to cover her tracks. I agreed to think about it. What else could I say without revealing that I already knew what was really going on? She hugged me, the first physical contact she'd initiated in months, and I felt nothing but disgust. Not at her touch, but at the situation, at the manipulation, at the assumption that I was stupid enough to fall for this. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and accepted the truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. My marriage was over. It had probably been over since those extra shifts started. Since the distance began, since she started treating me like a roommate instead of a husband. The only question now was how to handle it. I could confront her immediately, but that would give her time to create a better story. Maybe even claim the baby was mine from some encounter I'd forgotten. I could wait and see how far she'd take this charade, gathering evidence along the way. One thing was certain. I wasn't going to be anyone's fool, not anymore. If she thought she could manipulate me into raising another man's child, she'd picked the wrong guy. I might have been blind to what was happening, but I wasn't going to stay blind. The next morning, she was unusually affectionate, making me coffee, asking about my day, touching my arm when she talked. All the intimacy that had been missing for months suddenly returned the moment she needed something from me. It would have been pathetic if it wasn't so calculated. I played along, but I was already planning my next moves. First, I needed to confirm what I suspected. Then I needed to decide how to protect myself. Because when someone shows you who they really are, you better believe them the first time. I became a detective in my own home, and the evidence was everywhere. Once I started looking, the picture that emerged wasn't pretty. Her phone habits told the whole story. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter, face up, without a care. Now it lived in her purse or pocket, always face down when she had to set it somewhere. The sound was permanently off, but I noticed her checking it constantly. Wednesday morning, I watched her from the kitchen as she sat in the living room scrolling through messages. Her face lit up reading something. Then she quickly typed a response with the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. When I walked into the room, she immediately switched apps like nothing had happened. "Work stuff," she said before I even asked. But it was 7 in the morning. Her shift didn't start until noon. I started tracking her patterns. She claimed those extra shifts were mandatory, but her schedule made no sense. Sometimes she'd leave at 2 in the afternoon for what she called a morning shift. Other times she'd be gone all evening for day coverage. When I casually asked about the overtime pay showing up in our account, she got defensive and said it would appear next month. The gym membership was another interesting development. She joined 3 months ago, right around the time our bedroom went Arctic. Suddenly she needed to work out every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Strange thing was, she never came home looking like she'd actually exercised. No gym smell, no exhaustion, her hair still perfectly styled. I decided to test her stories. Last Thursday, I drove by the gym during her supposed workout time. Her car wasn't there. When she came home 2 hours later and I mentioned driving past the gym, she quickly explained she'd switched to a different location closer to work. Funny how she'd never mentioned this other location before. Her behavior around the house changed too. She used to be a creature of habit. Now everything was different. She'd take long showers as soon as she got home, washing away evidence I couldn't see but definitely suspected. Her laundry habits shifted. Clothes that used to sit in the hamper for days suddenly needed immediate washing. The most telling change was her sudden interest in our finances. She'd never cared about our savings account before, but now she was asking questions about our emergency fund, our insurance policies. What would happen if we had unexpected expenses? All perfectly reasonable questions for someone planning a pregnancy. All perfectly convenient questions for someone planning an exit strategy. I started paying attention to her conversations too. She'd always been chatty about her coworkers, but now there were gaps in her stories. She'd mentioned going to lunch with colleagues, but when I asked about specific people she used to talk about, she'd get vague or change the subject. One evening, she came home with a story about helping a coworker move furniture. She was gone for 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon. When I asked where this coworker lived, she gave me an address that didn't exist. I checked. There's no Maple Street where she said there was. The lies were getting sloppy, but she wasn't worried about getting caught. That told me everything I needed to know about how stupid she thought I was. In her mind, I was just the reliable husband who paid the bills and asked no questions. The safety net who'd accept whatever story she fed me. She kept bringing up the baby topic, getting more persistent each day. By Friday, she was showing me articles about pregnancy nutrition and suggesting we start taking vitamins together. The urgency was building, and I could guess why. Whatever timeline she was working with, it was getting shorter. I started documenting everything, not because I planned some dramatic confrontation, but because I needed to keep track of the lies. When someone is deceiving you systematically, the details matter. Inconsistencies pile up and eventually create an undeniable pattern. The weekend brought new revelations. She suggested we spend Saturday apart so she could have girl time with her sister. But when her sister called the house Sunday morning asking where she'd been, it became clear they hadn't spent any time together. Another lie. Another thread in the web she was weaving. By Sunday night, I had enough evidence to confirm what I'd suspected from the beginning. My wife was having an affair, and she was trying to manipulate me into believing her pregnancy was mine. The question wasn't whether she was cheating anymore. The question was how long it had been going on, and how far she planned to take the charade. I found myself oddly calm about the whole situation. Maybe because the uncertainty was finally over. I knew where I stood, knew what I was dealing with, knew what needed to happen next. There's something liberating about clarity, even when the truth is ugly. She was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, humming under her breath, probably thinking about how well her plan was working. Tomorrow she'd probably escalate the baby pressure, maybe suggest we see a doctor about fertility planning. All part of building the narrative that would explain her pregnancy when she announced it. But I wasn't going to be part of her story anymore. She'd made her choices, and now I was going to make mine. The difference was that my choices would be based on truth instead of deception. And unlike her, I wasn't going to pretend this marriage could be saved when it was already dead. I chose Thursday evening for the confrontation. She'd just returned from another fake work shift, still glowing from whatever time she'd spent with him. She was in the kitchen making herself a snack, humming that same tune she'd been humming for weeks, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "About your pregnancy." She froze for a moment, then turned around with confusion on her face. "What pregnancy? We haven't even started trying yet." "The pregnancy you're already carrying. The The one you're trying to convince me is mine." The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly. Too quickly. She'd probably rehearsed responses for this scenario just in case. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you feeling okay?" I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo I'd taken of her car at the apartment complex. "This was Wednesday afternoon during your work shift. Except you weren't at work. Your employer confirmed you haven't worked a full schedule in months." She stared at the photo, her mind racing through possible explanations. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much she could still deny. "That's my friend's place. She needed help with something." "The same friend who sent you a text at 6 this morning saying he missed you?" Now the panic set in. She realized I'd seen the message, that her phone security had failed her at the worst possible moment. "You went through my phone." "I didn't need to. You left it where I could see the notification, just like you left it where I could see all the other signs of your affair." She tried a different approach, switching to offense instead of defense. "You're paranoid. You're seeing things that aren't there because you're insecure." "Am I? Then explain why you suddenly want a baby after months of rejecting any physical contact. Explain why you're asking about our savings and insurance. Explain why you've been lying about work schedules and overtime pay." Each question hit like a hammer blow. She had answers prepared for some of them, but not all of them, and definitely not all at once. The foundation of lies was crumbling faster than she could rebuild it. "I don't have to explain anything to you. You're acting crazy." Crazy would be believing that a woman who hasn't touched her husband in 4 months suddenly wants to get pregnant. Crazy would be thinking those tears in your eyes are from guilt instead of panic about getting caught. She wasn't crying from remorse. She was crying because her plan was falling apart, because the timeline she'd carefully constructed was collapsing, because the man she thought was too stupid to notice had noticed everything. "It's not what you think," she said, finally abandoning complete denial. "It's exactly what I think. You're pregnant with another man's child, and you're trying to trick me into believing it's mine. The only question is whether you're going to keep lying or finally tell the truth." She sat down across from me, probably realizing that partial honesty was her best remaining option. "It just happened. I never meant for it to go this far." "How far? How long has this been going on?" "A few months. It doesn't mean anything." "A few months of lying to my face means nothing. Having his key to his apartment means nothing. Planning to make me raise his child means nothing." She flinched at each accusation because they were all true and she knew it. The affair wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a systematic betrayal that had been going on longer than she wanted to admit. "I was going to tell you when. After I signed the birth certificate? After I'd spent 18 years paying for another man's child? It's not like that. It's exactly like that. You calculated the timing perfectly. Months of no intimacy, then sudden baby fever right when you needed to explain a pregnancy. You thought I was too stupid to notice the timeline." She tried tears next, the kind of desperate crying that's supposed to make men feel guilty for being mean to their wives. But these weren't tears of a woman who'd made a mistake. These were tears of someone who'd been caught in a carefully planned deception. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I'll end it? I want you to stop insulting my intelligence. This isn't about ending anything. This is about you moving out and starting your new life with the father of your child. You're throwing away our marriage over a mistake." "I'm not throwing away anything. You already threw it away months ago when you started building a life with someone else. I'm just acknowledging reality." She switched tactics again, trying to negotiate like this was a business deal instead of the end of our marriage. "We can work through this. Couples survive affairs all the time. Couples don't survive women trying to trick their husbands into raising other men's children. That's not an affair. That's fraud." The word fraud hit her like a slap. She probably hadn't thought about the legal implications of what she was attempting. Paternity fraud isn't just morally wrong, it's legally problematic, especially when it involves financial support. "I need time to think about this," she said, probably hoping to regroup and come up with a better strategy. "You've had months to think. You thought your way into this situation and now you need to deal with the consequences. Pack your things. You can stay with your friend tonight. You can't just kick me out of my own house. This isn't your house anymore. It stopped being your house when you started keeping another man's key in your purse." She realized the conversation was over, that no amount of tears or manipulation was going to change the outcome. For the first time in months, she was seeing me clearly, not as the reliable husband who'd accept any story, but as the man who'd figured out her game and refused to play it. "This isn't over," she said, standing up with whatever dignity she had left. "Yes, it is. The only thing left to decide is whether you leave with some respect intact, or whether I have to explain to everyone why you're really moving out." She got the message. Public exposure of her affair and attempted paternity fraud wasn't something she wanted to risk. Better to leave quietly and let people think it was a mutual decision. As she packed her things, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. The uncertainty was over, the lies were exposed, the marriage was done, but my self-respect was intact. She left that night with 2 suitcases, and whatever pride she could salvage. But leaving was just the beginning. The real consequences started the next morning when I made it clear this wasn't a temporary separation or a cooling-off period. First call was to a divorce attorney. I wasn't interested in counseling, mediation, or working things out. I wanted legal protection from any future claims about the child she was carrying. The lawyer was impressed by how much documentation I'd gathered, and how clearly I could prove the timeline of events. "Most men in your situation don't figure it out until after they've signed the birth certificate," he said. "You're saving yourself years of legal complications." The paperwork was filed by noon, divorce proceedings with specific language about paternity disputes and financial responsibility for children conceived during extramarital affairs. Everything legally bulletproof, everything designed to protect me from her attempts to make me responsible for another man's child. She tried calling that afternoon, probably expecting me to have calmed down and reconsidered. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was predictable. She wanted to talk, to explain, to work things out. The same manipulation tactics that might have worked if I hadn't already moved past anger into action. I called her back once, just to deliver a simple message. "All communication goes through my attorney now. You have his number." "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaking. "We can figure this out without lawyers. We already figured it out. You chose him. I chose self-respect. Everything else is just paperwork." She hung up, probably realizing that the husband she thought she could manipulate no longer existed. The man she was dealing with now had no interest in her tears, her explanations, or her attempts to minimize what she'd done. By Friday, word was getting around our social circle. I didn't broadcast the details, but I didn't hide them either. When people asked what happened, I gave them the simple truth. She was pregnant with another man's child and had been lying about it. The reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Most people were shocked but supportive. A few tried to play devil's advocate, suggesting couples therapy or forgiveness. I shut those conversations down quickly. "Would you raise another man's child if your wife tried to trick you into it?" I asked one well-meaning friend. He had no answer. Because there is no answer. What she did wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was calculated fraud, and everyone knew it once they understood the timeline. Her sister called Saturday morning, probably sent by her to test whether I was serious about the divorce. The conversation was brief and enlightening. "She made a mistake, but she loves you," her sister said. "She loves my financial stability and my willingness to be manipulated. That's not the same thing as loving me. People make mistakes. Marriages survive worse things. Name one thing worse than trying to trick your husband into raising another man's child." Silence. Because there isn't anything worse in a marriage than systematic deception designed to make you responsible for the consequences of your spouse's affair. "She's family," her sister tried again. She was family. Now she's the mother of someone else's child who tried to make it my problem. Family doesn't do that. The conversation ended there. Her family could choose sides if they wanted, but I wasn't interested in their opinions about my decisions. They weren't the ones being asked to raise a child that wasn't theirs. Sunday brought an interesting development. She showed up at the house with him, probably thinking that introducing me to her affair partner would somehow normalize the situation. They stayed in the car when they realized I was watching from the window. I walked outside and approached the driver's side where he was sitting. He looked exactly like what you'd expect. Younger than me, probably unemployed or underemployed. The kind of guy who'd let a married woman support him financially. "You must be the father," I said through his open window. He looked uncomfortable but tried to play tough. "We just came to get some of her things." "Her things are already packed. They're in the garage. But since you're here, let me give you some advice. When the DNA test proves that kid is yours, don't try to run. She's expensive, and she's your responsibility now." His face went pale. He probably hadn't thought about the financial implications of his affair either. Supporting a woman and a child when you're barely supporting yourself is a reality check most guys his age aren't prepared for. She got out of the car, probably embarrassed by how the conversation was going. You don't have to be cruel about this. I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. You two created this situation, and now you get to deal with it together, without me. I loaded her remaining belongings into their car while they stood there awkwardly. Books, clothes, personal items, wedding photos she'd probably want to throw away anyway. Everything that connected her to my life removed in 15 minutes. "This is really how you want to end things?" she asked as I closed their trunk. "I didn't end anything. You ended it months ago when you started sleeping with him. I'm just making it official." They drove away, and I watched until their car disappeared around the corner. That was probably the last time I'd see either of them, unless there were court proceedings related to the divorce. The house felt different immediately, not empty or sad, but clean, like a weight had been lifted, like I could finally breathe properly again. For the first time in months, I was living in a space that wasn't contaminated by lies and deception. I spent the rest of the day changing locks, canceling joint accounts, and removing her access to anything connected to my life. Practical steps that made the separation real and irreversible. By evening, there was no trace of her left except for the lessons I'd learned about trusting the wrong person. Monday morning brought a call from my attorney with good news. She'd contacted him about settling everything quickly and quietly. No contest, no demands for alimony, no claims about the pregnancy. She wanted out as fast as possible. Probably because her new relationship couldn't handle the scrutiny of a prolonged legal battle. Smart move on her part. Fighting this would only expose more details about her deception. The papers would be final within 60 days. After that, she'd be completely free to build whatever life she wanted with the father of her child. And I'd be completely free to build a life with someone who understood the difference between love and manipulation. 6 months later, I was sitting in my renovated kitchen drinking coffee and reading about her divorce from the guy she left me for. Yes, they'd gotten married. Yes, it had fallen apart spectacularly. And yes, she was now a single mother, trying to get child support from a man who disappeared the moment fatherhood became financially inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd thrown away a stable marriage with a man who would have supported her through anything for a fantasy relationship, with someone who bolted the moment things got complicated. Sometimes life teaches lessons in the most poetic ways possible. My lawyer called that morning to let me know she'd attempted to file a paternity suit against me. Apparently, her new reality was financially challenging, and she decided to try claiming I was the father after all. The attempt lasted exactly as long as it took to produce the timeline evidence I'd documented. Case dismissed with prejudice, he told me. The judge wasn't amused by her attempt to rewrite history. I wasn't surprised. Desperate people make desperate moves, and supporting a child alone was probably harder than she'd anticipated when she was planning her exit strategy. But that was her problem now, not mine. The house had become something completely different over those 6 months, not just redecorated, but redesigned around my actual preferences instead of compromises that kept someone else happy. Every space reflected choices made by someone who knew exactly what he wanted. Friends had been supportive throughout the entire process, though some took longer to understand why I'd refused to consider reconciliation. The ones who mattered got it immediately. The ones who didn't matter revealed themselves through their willingness to excuse betrayal. "You seem happier," my brother said during a visit. "More like yourself than you've been in years." He was right. The man I'd become during my marriage hadn't been the real me. I'd been a version of myself edited down to fit someone else's comfort zone, someone else's need for a reliable provider who asked no questions. Dating wasn't a priority yet. But when it happened, it would be completely different. No more ignoring red flags for the sake of keeping peace. No more accepting disrespect disguised as compatibility issues. Any woman in my future would have to earn trust instead of expecting it as a default setting. The experience taught me something valuable about intuition. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong. When patterns don't make sense, there's usually a reason. When someone's behavior changes dramatically without explanation, they're usually hiding something significant. I'd ignored my instincts for months, making excuses for behavior that should have been inexcusable. Never again. Trust is earned through consistency, not demanded through manipulation. Some nights I wondered what would have happened if I'd confronted her earlier, if I'd acted on my suspicions instead of gathering evidence. But I knew the answer. She would have created a better cover story, been more careful about hiding the truth, maybe even convinced me I was paranoid. By waiting, by documenting everything, I protected myself legally and emotionally. The divorce was clean, the separation was complete, and my conscience was clear. She'd made her choices based on immediate gratification and fantasy thinking. I'd made mine based on long-term consequences and realistic expectations. The results spoke for themselves. 6 months of rebuilding had taught me that starting over isn't punishment for making mistakes. Sometimes it's a reward for finally making the right decision. The marriage I'd fought to save wasn't worth saving. The woman I'd thought I'd lost wasn't worth keeping. Moving forward meant moving up. Not just to a better relationship someday, but to a better understanding of my own worth and what I was willing to accept from other people. The phone rang that evening. Unknown number, but I recognized her voice immediately when I answered. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize for everything. Apology noted, I said. Anything else? I made a huge mistake. I realize that now. You made a series of calculated decisions. Own them. She hung up, probably expecting a different response. Maybe hoping for forgiveness, reconciliation, or at least a lengthy conversation about what went wrong. But there was nothing left to discuss. She'd shown me who she really was, and I'd responded accordingly. The chapter was closed, the book was finished, and the sequel would be written without her. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. Looking back 6 months later, I realized the deepest wound wasn't the betrayal itself. The betrayal was ugly, calculated, and cruel, but it was also clarifying. The real pain came from the slow erosion of who I had allowed myself to become while I was married to her. For years I had been the good husband, the one who paid the bills on time, fixed whatever broke, deflected uncomfortable questions from family, and swallowed every small rejection with a smile because that's what a real man does. I told myself I was being patient, strong, understanding. In reality, I was training myself to ignore my own instincts, to accept disrespect as normal, to treat my own needs as optional. I had become so skilled at keeping the peace that I forgot peace purchased with self-erasure isn't peace at all, it's just quiet surrender. When she sat on that couch and announced she wanted a baby after 4 months of treating me like I was radioactive, something inside me finally snapped awake. Not rage, not even heartbreak at first. It was recognition. I recognized the feeling of being used. I recognized the pattern of being the reliable backup plan. And for the first time in years, I recognized my own worth. The calm that settled over me during those weeks of quiet investigation wasn't numbness. It was power returning. Every lie I uncovered, every inconsistent story I documented, was another brick I reclaimed from the prison I had built around myself. I wasn't gathering evidence against her. I was gathering evidence for me. Proof that my gut had been right all along. Proof that I still had the clarity and strength I thought marriage had slowly drained out of me. The day she walked out with her 2 suitcases, I expected to feel empty. Instead, I felt spacious. Like a house that had been overcrowded for years suddenly had room to breathe. I walked from room to room that night and realized every corner still carried the faint residue of compromise. The couch I didn't love, but she did. The paint color chosen to avoid an argument. The quiet Sundays I spent bracing for the next subtle criticism. All of it suddenly felt temporary, removable, replaceable. The life I had been protecting wasn't sacred, it was just familiar. And familiar had been killing me slowly. There were nights, in the beginning, when the silence felt too loud. Nights when muscle memory made me reach for a body that wasn't there anymore. Nights when anger would rise like bile and I'd have to remind myself that anger is a secondary emotion. Beneath it was grief. Grief not for her but for the version of me who thought love required self-betrayal. Grief for the years I spent shrinking so someone else could feel tall. But grief passes. Anger fades. What remains is a kind of crystalline gratitude. Gratitude that I woke up before I became a father to another man's child. Gratitude that I discovered my spine was still there, just atrophied from lack of use. Gratitude that the worst thing that ever happened to me became the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to become a man who will never again confuse tolerance with strength, silence with patience, or being needed with being loved. I'm not the same man she tried to trap. I'm the man who walked through fire and came out the other side knowing exactly what I will and will not accept. That knowledge is worth more than the marriage I lost. It's the foundation of every relationship I'll ever have from this day forward, including the most important one, the one I now have with myself. She didn't break me. She freed me. And freedom, it turns out, feels a lot like peace, only louder, brighter, and entirely mine.